Hello, everyone, and welcome to altPOV.radio. Our guest this evening is Dr. Andrew Nichols. Andrew Nichols is a psychologist, parapsychologist, and investigator of alleged poltergeist cases and other paranormal phenomena. Dr. Nichols is a member of the American Psychological Association, the Parapsychological Association, and the Society for Psychological Hypnosis. He's also been a psychology professor for many years and is an adjunct faculty in parapsychology at Santa Fe College in Gainesville. This is going to be a really good show tonight. Dr. Nichols, during his 30-year career, he's investigated more than 600 reported cases of ghosts, hauntings, and poltergeists, and he's conducted numerous studies in telepathy, precognition, paranormal dream experiences, and he's written numerous articles on paranormal experiences for magazines such as Fate, and for many his scientific papers on the paranormal have been published in journals such as the Journal of Parapsychology, the International Journal of Parapsychology, the European Journal of Parapsychology, and the Proceedings of the Parapsychological Association. He's also the author of Ghost Detective, Adventures of a Parapsychologist, and his work has been featured in many books on paranormal topics. He's also been on several television shows, including ABC's The World's Scariest Ghost, the Discovery Channel's Real Ghosthunters and Ghost Detectives, and Beyond Death on A&E. Dr. Nichols, welcome to the show tonight.
Hi, Jack. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight.
Oh, it's a pleasure having you. It really is. You and I have had many really interesting conversations over the years, and I really, when we decided that we were going to do a podcast, you were one of the first people I wanted to get on, because I knew it would be. It's always an interesting conversation when I talk to you. So, and I think tonight is going to be really interesting, because tonight what we want to do is we want to talk about some possibilities and some theories associated with UFOs, UFO phenomena, and haunting phenomena, and some of the similarities that are in both kinds of phenomena. And I think, a good way to start this, a few years ago, we had discussed the idea of UFOs as interdimensional phenomena, and we had talked briefly about it. Can you, interdimensional phenomena as opposed to interplanetary phenomena, can you elaborate on that? And I think that would be a great way for us to start, and then we'll go from there.
Well, the idea that UFOs represent extraterrestrial spacecraft is probably the most popular explanation for UFOs among the general public. Although it hasn't always been so. Even going back to the 1950s, the earliest Gallup polls on UFO beliefs among the general public found that the extraterrestrial hypothesis wasn't even among the top three in terms of favorite explanations of the general public. It was mostly the media during the late 50s and 60s and 70s that drove the idea of extraterrestrial visitation as being the best explanation. But there have always been researchers and investigators who proposed alternate explanations, including the idea that UFOs came from beneath the oceans, from an undersea civilization, that UFOs came from inside the hollow earth. That was quite a popular theory, particularly in the early 1960s, and the idea that UFOs may have come from other dimensions, or perhaps from our own future, that they might represent future humans, time travelers. So there's certainly these alternate explanations that in many ways, some of these explanations might be more viable than the extraterrestrial hypothesis for a variety of reasons. I personally regard UFOs as being aerial apparitions, that they're essentially the same type of phenomena that you have in poltergeist and haunting cases, except that they're generally viewed in the sky rather than in context on the ground.
Okay, so basically, then the idea of UFOs are really parapsychological phenomena. Then is what you're saying, is from that standpoint, rather than interplanetary.
Well, I don't think it's necessarily a question of one or the other. There's no question that UFOs have a strong parapsychological or paranormal component, although I have colleagues who are very interested in UFO research who resent it when I apply the term paranormal to UFOs. But I don't think there's any question that there's a strong paranormal or parapsychological component to UFO experiences. Not all of them, but certainly many. Now, whether there is an additional physical component also, that's always a possibility. And whether there is or isn't a parapsychological component doesn't necessarily rule out the possibility that they might be extraterrestrial in origin. I just don't think that the evidence points in that direction, personally. But yes, I do regard them as a parapsychological phenomenon and don't believe that ufology, the study of UFOs, should be regarded as a distinct discipline, distinct from parapsychology. And I feel the same way about cryptozoology, by the way. I think it's basically the same principle, that we're primarily dealing with parapsychological phenomena there too.
Right. Well, you always hear, well, Bigfoot, and then it all gets garbled. It's like, well, can Bigfoot be an alien being, or is it? What I would like to talk a little bit about is interplanetary is that's a clear definition. Obviously, interplanetary would mean that these vehicles and the people that pilot them, the beings who pilot them, are coming from another planet, whether it be in obviously a different solar system or wherever they may be coming from. That's interplanetary. Now, from a parapsychological standpoint, let's define that a little more. Tell us a little bit about what does that mean? Like, based on the types of experiences that people have with UFO sightings, etc., why would that fit into that category? Give us some examples if you can.
Well, probably the best way to look at it is by comparing sort of accepted parapsychological phenomena such as apparition experiences specifically, comparing that with UFO experiences and see what parallels there might be. And what you find is that the parallels are striking. For example, UFOs are often observed to appear or disappear suddenly. Apparition, we can use the term ghosts if you want to, although there are a variety of different types of apparitions, of course. But ghosts or apparitions also are said to appear and disappear suddenly. UFOs are seen floating or flying in the sky. Ghosts are also sometimes seen hovering or floating above the ground. UFOs are seen to perform feats which seem to defy gravity and defy physical limitations of known physical science. Ghosts and apparitions are also able to do this. Apparitions are usually experienced as being three-dimensional and solid. This is a very important point. Most people who see apparitions mistake them for a living person until they suddenly disappear. Unless it's a case of a post-mortem apparition, or what people call after-death communications, where the person is known to the observer to be dead, and so they recognize immediately that what they're dealing with is not a solid three-dimensional person. But in most cases, in hauntings, for example, most people who see apparitions very distinctly mistake them for living human beings until they engage in some extraordinary behavior or suddenly disappear, which tells the person, or maybe only in retrospect do they realize that they weren't dealing with a three-dimensional flesh and blood person. So my point here is simply that ghosts or apparitions appear to be almost always three-dimensional and solid. UFOs also, of course, appear to be three-dimensional and solid. And because of that, people assume they must be three-dimensional and solid. But like ghosts, they're often self-luminous. Ghosts are often reported as self-luminous. UFOs are shape-shifting. They often change from one shape to another while being observed. Sometimes they become semi-transparent or transparent before they completely disappear or as they appear. So they may vary in their appearance from completely solid, three-dimensional, nuts and bolts spacecraft appearing objects to very nebulous, luminous, shape-shifting protean forms of light. So UFOs, like apparitions, have a variety of ways of manifesting themselves, but very similar. The suggestions are very similar. In addition to that, apparitions come with a whole collection of other paranormal experiences, such as telepathic communication, Many people report having telepathic communications with apparitions. Many people report having telepathic communications with UFOs. People report poltergeist activity in the vicinity of apparitions, particularly in certain types of haunting cases. Many people have reported poltergeist activity associated with UFOs also. So there are many types of paranormal or parapsychological phenomena which are at the very least associated with UFO experiences. And that suggests to me that the entire experience may in fact be a parapsychological or psychic or paranormal experience, and that it doesn't represent interstellar spacecraft in terms of technology at all. And I think you have to look back and where did the idea of interstellar spacecraft come from? How did UFOs become associated with that? Well, in the 19th century and even in the early 20th century, remember that our understanding of the other planets of our solar system was much more limited than it is now. And so it was quite plausible to people in those days that there might be intelligent life forms on Mars or on Venus, for example, or even Jupiter or Saturn. And those were plausible possibilities. And if that were the case, then interstellar spacecraft would be quite possible, because although the distances between the planets within our solar system are vast, they're not so incredibly vast as they are between star systems. But once we started to understand that, and so the original UFO occupants were believed to come from places like Mars and Venus. Even in the 1950s, during the contactee movement, people like George Adamski regarded his contacts as being from Venus, and they self-identified as being from Venus and Mars and even the moon. There were even people living on the moon. But of course, now we understand that at least humanoid life of our kind could not exist in any of those places. There might be bacteria or some type of moss growing on Mars or something, but there's no civilization there unless it's invisible and essentially ghost-like. So now we've had to expand our concept of extraterrestrial to include other star systems, not just other planets within our star system. And suddenly it becomes far less plausible, not impossible, but compared to the previous concept of interplanetary travel, interstellar travel is many magnitudes more difficult and does not correspond to any theory of propulsion that we currently have or any real extrapolation of propulsion systems, unless you're talking about intergenerational craft and that sort of thing, which most people think that UFOs have propulsion systems that are so far in advance of anything that we have that they are just beyond the comprehension of present-day physics, which is possible. That is possible. But I do think that you cannot rule out that there's a strong paranormal factor involved in UFO sightings.
Well, one of the things that's interesting is, and we realized this with the Stan Romanek case that we were involved with for quite a while, that there were haunting aspects to his case. So in other words, he had all of these things, UFO related, alien abduction related experiences. But then his home became very active from what you might call a haunting or poltergeist standpoint, where faucets would turn on and off by themselves. There were shadow people. There were a lot of orbs, although these orbs seemed more like they were almost like monitoring devices or some type of something like that, more than ghostly. But having said all that now. So what is happening? Explain then what might happen what is happening when a person may see a UFO and obviously think it is what it is. From a parapsychological standpoint, what is really happening? What would that process be like in the brain?
Well, we have to ask ourselves where the origin of this intelligence is. UFOs, like apparitions, are certainly motivated by some kind of intelligence. So they behave in an interactive way. I mean, many witnesses over many years have emphasized how interactive and intelligent these things appear to be. So they're not just static projections of some kind. There is some type of intelligence motivating them. Now, whether these are projections from an alien intelligence, which is extraterrestrial in origin, or extra dimensional in origin or subterranean, or whether it is a projection from our own subconscious mind, is something that we don't have the answer to that question. And the reason that we don't is because the limitations of our own consciousness is unknown. We don't know what the limitations are of ESP, of psychokinesis, of the human psychological processes. Most psychologists agree that the vast majority of our consciousness is hidden from our conscious awareness. And, of course, some psychologists like Carl Jung speculated that there is an objective or collective unconscious that we share with all other human beings as well. And in fact, one of the best books ever written about the UFO phenomenon was Carl Jung's 1956 book on flying saucers, which he wrote from a standpoint of analytical psychology, in which he proposed that they are essentially projections or archetypal projections from the collective unconscious. But when you explain this to people, they misunderstand that, well, you're saying that these are hallucinations or that they're not real. But this is actually not the case. These projections are real. They are just as real and physical as this computer that I'm talking to or this chair that I'm sitting in. These things have properties which are quasi-physical at least. In other words, they're able to interact with physical matter. They may produce radar echoes, which of course UFOs have on numerous occasions, and ghosts have been sometimes photographed, but many times they're unable to be photographed. There's another parallel with UFOs. Sometimes they show up on radar, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they can be photographed, sometimes they can't. So again, both apparitions and UFOs share these characteristics of quasi-physicality, that they have some characteristics which suggest that they're physical and solid and three-dimensional, and they have other characteristics which suggest that they're more like a dream image. So there's some type of an intermediate state, something between matter and mind. And it is within this state that you find paranormal phenomena of all kinds occurring, this intermediate state, this twilight state. Or another way to look at it would be to say that there are two kinds of reality. There's physical reality that we're all familiar with, but there's also psychical reality. And psychical reality is not the same as fantasy or imagination. It is not only equally real, just as real as physical reality, but it in fact, in my view, is the primary reality. In other words, in my opinion, physical reality is actually an emergent property. It's something that emerges out of psychical reality, and that psychical reality was there first. Psychical reality was primary. And if I can use a quick illustration from Carl Jung's book on flying saucers, which I've always found to be a very interesting observation, and this comes from a dream that Jung had. He dreamed that he was standing on the shores of Lake Geneva near his home. And in this dream, a flying saucer approached him across the lake. And this flying saucer was sort of a typical lens-shaped or disc-shaped craft. Approached him and then stopped hovering over the lake some distance away. And as he looked at this in his dream, as he looked at this flying saucer, suddenly a device came down out of the bottom of the saucer and shone a light on him. And he said the device looked like an old-fashioned slide projector, what they used to call a magic camera, where it would project slides. So he was in the spotlight of this projection. And he said when he analyzed this dream, he realized a very important point. And this is something that people have a hard time wrapping their brains around. But he realized that the saucer was not his projection, because he had always sort of thought of it in terms of flying saucers being a psychological projection. He said, the saucer was not my projection. I was their projection. It is the human life. It is the ego, which is what we think of when we think of ourselves. It is the ego that is the projection of the greater consciousness, which pre-existed the ego, and which has access to much greater information, and which has this numinous or sacred quality to it. And so our egos, which we think of as being us, are really a projection of this greater mass of information and energy that pre-existed our ego. And it is from that the UFO comes. The UFO is a representation of that greater reality from which we derive. So it's sort of switching the roles, that rather than thinking of UFOs as psychological projections, rather think that we are their projections. And I think that gives you a better idea of which reality is actually more primary. And that may seem a little arcane to a lot of people that listen to this, but I think if you give it some thought, you may recognize that what we're dealing with is a vast intelligence of some sort, but it's alien to us because we sense it as being separate from our egos. It's alien to our egos, different to us. Therefore, we assume that it must come from outer space. But outer space is just another example of the great unknown. It's and flying saucers are seen in liminal zone, in the space in the atmosphere, which is the space between the Earth, which is the known, and the great unknown of outer space, and in between is the atmosphere, and that's where we see UFOs. And just like ghosts are often seen in cemeteries and in dark, shadowy houses, which are liminal zones between light and darkness, liminal zones between life and death. People have near-death experiences in liminal zones between life and death. People have paranormal experiences in the period between sleeping and waking, the hypnagogic state, the period, this liminal zone between waking and sleep. So these things are liminal experiences, and UFOs fall right into the same category. I don't know if this makes much sense, but
no, it does, and I think we're getting deep here with some things, and I think that I think for most people, you made a good point, and you said that someone, if someone sees something, and we'll get to this in a second, but there are groups of people who have also seen UFOs. There have been, I know in Mexico City, there are hundreds of people who have seen something. They have this, lots of video footage of several people showing the footage in the sky, and there's these lights up there or whatever they are. But I think you're right. I think that people tend to be like, hey, I know what I saw. Don't tell me it was a hallucination. But I think hallucination is maybe not the proper word to use, or it just has a bad connotation. It's a negative connotation for people because they think, hey, I'm not crazy. Well, that's not what you're saying. That has nothing to do with it.
No, and you're right. Hallucination does have a bad connotation. I think apparition is a much better term. And I would remind you that many people have collectively seen apparitions too.
That's right, and that's what I was gonna ask you about that. So there are collective sightings of these things, right?
Absolutely. But as with UFOs, apparitions have a quasi-physical quality. In other words, if you have 10 people who are in a position to see an apparition or ghost when they walk by, chances are more than one of them will see it. But chances are all 10 of them will not see it. So right. It has a physical quality of being able to be seen collectively, whereas something that's purely subjective, like a dream, typically can only be seen by the dreamer. So this has a physical quality in the sense that more than one person can see it, but it doesn't have a completely physical quality because not everyone can see it. It seems to depend on perhaps the degree of ESP that the individual possesses or the state of consciousness. If the person is in a suitably receptive state, then there is kind of a telepathic contagion that takes place that allows more than one person to view approximately the same thing at the same time. But and of course, most people regard that as evidence of physicality, evidence that what they're looking at is a physical three-dimensional object. But that's not necessarily true because we know that some non-physical objects like apparitions are seen by as many as 9 people. The largest number of people I've ever heard of that saw a ghost at one time was 9. And I've certainly had cases where 3 or 4 people saw the apparition simultaneously. So if they can be collectively viewed, then they appear to have some kind of a quasi or semi-physical component to them, and yet they obviously aren't completely physical because they appear and disappear. But again, UFOs, of course, leave landing traces. They leave scorched patches on the ground and landing pod marks and so on. But ghosts also are able to interact with physical matter as they do in poltergeist cases. Ghosts are seen to open and close doors. They're seen to move objects. And in case of apportation, objects will sometimes appear in haunting cases or in seance cases that weren't previously there. They just appear out of nowhere. So again, I don't think you can think of any characteristic of UFOs that cannot also be found among other types of apparitional cases. And I think the same thing is true when you're talking about Bigfoot cases and other types of cryptids.
Right. No, and that's a great point. And that's something that's so fascinating. And just for the benefit of the viewers and the listeners, what we're doing here, these are, we're talking about what could these things be? I don't think anyone has a definitive answer, but, in the case of you, Dr. Nichols, well, you've been doing this for so long, and you've been doing, you've done the research, you've had, you've done the field work, and you've done the, so many experiments, psychological experiments, with people and everything. And I think it's important for people to understand that there are so many possibilities out there, and we have to look at everything. And I think because we're so three-dimensional, we tend to be physical. Well, I saw it, or I took a picture of it. I personally, and this firsthand, that I've taken a picture of a couple apparitions. Right. So, okay, what does that mean? So there is a physicality to it. And I want to read, because I want to get into this, because this is interesting too, and we had talked about this previously. John Keel, the author of the Mothman Prophecies, he used the word ultraterrestrial, and he kind of used it as a catch-all explanation for all paranormal phenomena. And Jacques Vallée, which people know Jacques Vallée as a famous ufologist and researcher as well, he literally proposed a similar concept. But can you explain what they meant by this? That the ultra-terrestrial, what they were getting at?
Well, I don't know that either one of them has attempted to prove or to demonstrate an ultimate source of this intelligence. I think what they mean by ultra-terrestrial, Patrick Harper used the term demonic reality. Other writers have used the term the imaginal realm. It's difficult to define exactly what it is, other than a source of information, energy, and intelligence. And this source, I think when you try to narrowly define it, then you're in danger of losing part of the big picture. In other words, it could just as easily be defined as an incredibly advanced extraterrestrial race or extraterrestrial individual. It could be an extra-dimensional race or individual. It could be a time-traveling race or individual. It could be God. It could be the devil. I mean, the reality is all of these explanations derive from a particular worldview or particular model. And the reality is that we don't know what the ultimate, and I don't think that either John Keel or Jacques Vallée attempted to specifically identify the source, because we can't. There is no way. That's just pure speculation. The only thing we can say is that these phenomena have certain common characteristics, and that these characteristics are also found in a variety of other types of so-called paranormal or parapsychological experiences. And the similarities are such that it is reasonable to assume that they have a common source. And what that source is, we don't know. The source does appear to have, in some cases, access to greater knowledge than we do. But on the other hand, the source does not appear to be universally truthful, because deception and trickery is a common component of paranormal experiences. George Hansen's book, Paranormal and the Trickster, is a fascinating book because it's true. And of course, throughout human history, mythological motifs have always included a trickster spirit. So whatever these things are, as I mentioned to you the other day, a famous psychical researcher said that We don't know much about the spirit world, but we do know one thing about spirits, and that is that they lie. And I think that's true. That if you listen to the drivel that comes out of seance communications, and the same is true for a lot of the UFO communications. I've seen people channeling UFO aliens and so forth, and it's just largely drivel. And yet, associated with this quite frequently is genuine paranormal phenomena, genuine anomalies that can't be explained. And so how do you reconcile those two things? Well, what you have to do is basically try to ignore what they say. You don't listen to what the spirits tell you they are. You don't listen to what the UFO aliens tell you they are, because they come up with all sorts of different stories. And there is also obviously a cultural component to it. That it's not a sociological phenomenon exclusively, because there are genuine physical effects, there are genuine paranormal effects, and yet there is obviously a sociological component. In other words, these experiences are modified by the context, by the cultural context in which they occur. And that's why you have certain types of aliens tend to be seen in certain cultures, and other cultures often describe aliens very differently. In fact, the idea that the gray, sort of the insectoid gray, is sort of a universal motif is not true at all. I mean, it tends to be in the United States, but the reality is around the world you have hairy hominids and reptilians and winged creatures and silver robot creatures and so on. And although in this country they tend to be small, diminutive creatures, more like the fairy folk of European folklore, in other countries they're often 9 feet tall, 10 feet tall, and so on. So the reality is, either if the extraterrestrial hypothesis is true, then it would indicate that we are being visited not just by one extraterrestrial race, but by hundreds of extraterrestrial races. And that these races vary not only in their physical morphology and their physical appearance, but also the spacecraft themselves come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes. Not to mention their ability to shapeshift and appear and disappear and elude radar and so on. So they have primarily apparitional characteristics. They appear to be primarily some type of a paranormal phenomenon. But what the origin of that intelligence that motivates them is, I don't know. Sometimes I believe that they are, as Jung suggested perhaps, that they originate in the transpersonal unconscious or the collective unconscious. That they are part of sort of a universal field of consciousness from which each of our individual consciousness is only an extrusion, like a wave on an ocean. But on the other hand, they may just as easily have predated human consciousness. In other words, are these secondary, just like, again, parapsychologists have debated this about spirit guides and mediums control spirits. Because mediums generally have a spirit guide or a control that they use as an intermediary. And it's been debated for more than a century among parapsychologists as to whether these spirits are secondary personalities of the medium, something created by the unconscious mind of the medium, for which there is a considerable amount of evidence, or are they primary personalities? In other words, were they personalities that already existed before the medium was born? And I think the same can be said about this, that it's impossible to tell, because they behave in different ways under different circumstances. Sometimes they behave as if their wisdom exceeds that which is possible to a mere human consciousness. But many times they behave in a very infantile and silly way, like the constant, sexual aspects of the abduction experiences, the constant repetition of very crude pseudo-scientific experiments, usually with a sexual component, which any advanced race would have had more than enough genetic material by now to create a whole world of clones, and yet they continue to perform the same sorts of painful, humiliating, and sexually oriented. It doesn't make any sense that this is what this is. It's only superficially that it appears to conform to any type of scientific experimentation that human scientists might do, because that's usually the metaphor. Well, we dart animals in the wild and put tags on them and so forth. So that must be what they're doing to us. But it only appears that way superficially. If you look at it carefully and look at the thousands and thousands of cases, it appears more like sadistic children than it does any kind of sophisticated scientific pursuit. So it's mysterious. It's the origin of this intelligence is mysterious.
Right. You know, one of the things that even muddies the water further, I think, and we can talk about this a little bit. We had mentioned it again a couple of years ago when we talked about this, but interdimensional, the idea of an interdimensional being, or as something as an interdimensional phenomena, meaning that is it possible for these races to travel such long distances interdimensionally, whether through wormholes or whatever. Again, this is quantum physical. It's quantum physics, but the whole idea of interdimensional is always brought up as well. Is where are these interdimensional creatures? And for that matter, is Bigfoot and the Mothman, because they come and go. They're here, they're not here. They show up, but there's no real physical. There's only trace evidence, if any evidence at all. Why haven't we found a body for Bigfoot? Are they phasing in and out dimensionally? And sometimes I look, sometimes you see UFO footage, and you're right. The UFO footage, it almost seems like it's there, it's nothing there, and then it's all of a sudden it's there. It's like phasing in and out. And that is like an apparition does the same thing. But then say, well, are they phasing in and out interdimensionally? Is there some kind of a doorway that's opening that we can't see? Now, we have to. There's a little leap of faith here. We have to first believe that interdimensional there are more than the dimensions that we're aware of. Right? So we have to take that leap of faith. But if there are more than 4, 5 dimensions, then what do you think of that when people say to you, well, what about interdimensional beings? And they do talk a lot bit about the cryptoids and other all phenomena, all paranormal phenomena as interdimensional. What do you tend to say about that?
Well, I think, again, that's as good a theory as any, and that's certainly more consistent with what I'm talking about. Although, in a real way, it's a misnomer to use that term. Although it is true that modern quantum physics, what is known as string theory or M theory, does propose the existence of multiple dimensions. In fact, it demands the existence of multiple dimensions, as many as 11 dimensions. However, I think it's important to realize that these beings may not necessarily come from another dimension, to come from another world. I think it's more consistent with what we know about science as it is to talk about parallel worlds rather than other dimensions, because other dimensions has a very specific meaning. If you're proposing the existence of additional physical dimensions, because typically, we have the 3 physicals or spatial dimensions, and then sometimes time is regarded as a 4th dimension, although it is clearly quite different from the other 3. So whether it should be regarded as a dimension or not, is arguable. But it's not necessary to propose the existence of other dimensions to have parallel worlds. For example, we know that all matter vibrates at a specific frequency. And, of course, this is also what the occultists, the metaphysicians, and the spiritualists have proposed for 150 years, is that really what we're dealing with is another form of matter that simply vibrates at a different frequency, and therefore is capable of interacting with physical matter, capable of occupying the same space at the same time, which is quite possible. And it doesn't require the existence of any additional dimensions to do that. They can exist in the same spatial and temporal dimensions that we do. They're just existing on a different frequency range. And in order to be seen by us, they would either, assuming they're a higher frequency, they would have to lose energy to reduce their frequency rate to be visible or to be able to interact with matter at this level. If they're a lower frequency rate, they would have to raise their frequency rate. So, that explanation is just as plausible, if not more so, than the idea of other dimensions. Because it's really, when you think about other dimensions, it's difficult to imagine what other dimensions would be like, because we can't conceive of an additional dimension. And if an additional dimension did exist, and I'm talking about a physical, spatial dimension, if an additional dimension, could we even perceive it at all? Because our senses are entirely attuned to three-dimensional perception. So I think when people use the term other dimensions, often they're really talking about parallel universes. Right. And it doesn't necessarily require either a wormhole or another dimension to have parallel universes. So yes, I personally think that the parallel universe theory is a very good one, and it's consistent with what I've been talking about, because from my perspective as a parapsychologist, you and me are four-dimensional beings. All human beings already exist in four dimensions because mind constitutes its own dimension. It is a non-physical, non-spatial, non-temporal dimension, but it is a dimension. It exists as its own reality. And so we already are existing in two parallel worlds. As I mentioned earlier, the physical reality that we're familiar with and the psychical reality, or demonic reality, if you prefer to use that term, although that's often misunderstood because of the negative connotation of the word demon, which comes from the Judeo-Christian tradition. But of course, in the Greek tradition, it just simply meant a non-physical being. So I think that yes, there are beings that exist in parallel worlds. I do believe that that is true, and that these beings take many forms, and that those forms are probably derived from a combination of our cultural expectations, sort of a collective unconscious thing, or they're derived from our personal expectations, which would be something from what Jung called the personal unconscious. In other words, our personal ideas of what aliens might look like, or what primitive hominids might look like, or what ghosts should look like. So it comes from our personal unconscious, but it also comes from our culture, from our collective unconscious, which in turn is influenced by things like media and fiction. I mean, there certainly have been some very interesting studies done on UFOs and UFO encounters, which have connected them to very specific media events. And I don't think that's a coincidence. But I also don't believe, as my colleagues in psychology would believe, that that's simply evidence of the psychological origin of these things. I think that there is a connection with human psychology, and there's a connection with sociology, but I think that there's also an independent existence to these things. We have to stop thinking of these things as being either or. They're either subjective or they're objective. They're either real or they're not real. And I think that those are false dichotomies, that the reality of the universe is that they both are objective and subjective simultaneously, and that they are both what we would consider real or objective and subjective simultaneously. There's a connection between our unconscious minds and the physical world. And that's what parapsychology demonstrates, is that information can be exchanged within the physical world through a non-physical medium that we cannot specifically identify, and that even physical matter can be affected through a non-physical medium. So that connection between the physical and the non-physical, or between the dream world and the real world, is not so clear-cut. In fact, the two sort of just gradually meld together, and it's in this intermediate zone between the two that paranormal phenomena take place, if that makes sense.
No, it's fascinating. It really is. I mean, and I think, and that applies to spirit too. Like when you talk about the higher vibrational, that could theoretically apply to spirit, our spirit. Like right now in our physical bodies, we are of a certain vibration. We are of a certain, we inhabit a certain spectrum of energy, so to speak. And then perhaps when we die, the spirit, our actual spirit, might be at a higher frequency or higher vibration, which is why it kind of phases in and out. We can't, it's not something we can see. We can see all the time, right? With the visible spectrum of, right, our eyesight or what have you.
And that is actually what I believe. I believe that we exist right now in that higher reality, that you and I are already there. And so this idea of going somewhere when you die, for example, and I know we're off the UFO topic, but people,
this is great.
People have experience of going somewhere, leaving their body and traveling through a tunnel of light, but those are three-dimensional concepts. The idea of going, where are they going? Are they going up in the sky or in outer space, or where are they going? Now, I think the reality is that you're already there, that the experience of traveling from one place to another is really the experience of the filtering mechanisms of the brain breaking down at death and allowing consciousness to become aware of its location, of its true location, where it has always been. So wherever you are going to be when you die, in my view, you're already there. But the physical brain has filtering mechanisms that prevent us from realizing that we're already there. Just as, and this is for a very good reason, because if we lived with this awareness all the time, we would not be able to function as biological organisms. It would impede our survivability as biological organisms. And so we need to focus on things like reproduction and evolutionary advantage and that sort of thing while we're encased in these biological bodies. But then as we die and those filtering mechanisms break down, we just gradually become aware of the greater universe, the greater world, which we have always inhabited. And it makes sense. And a good analogy in the brain is the dreaming mechanism. When we are dreaming at night, the brain shuts down the muscular system of the body, which prevents us from acting out our dreams, so that we're paralyzed during our dream state. We might twitch a little bit or throw out an arm every now and then, but if our bodies were not paralyzed when we dream every night, we would act out our dreams every night. And that would be very dangerous. We'd be, running into walls or falling off buildings, running around asleep. But we don't do that for the most part, except for people who have sleep disorders. But for the most part, we don't act out our dreams because our bodies are paralyzed. And I think it's the same thing. That's a survival mechanism. And occasionally that survival mechanism glitches, and we walk in our sleep, or we have a night terror where we get out of bed and we're fighting with an invisible assailant or something. But that's a glitch. And I think the paranormal is a glitch like that. That the brain has physical mechanisms that prevent us from experiencing the greater reality most of the time. But every once in a while, the system glitches. And when it does, we have what we call a paranormal or supernatural or spiritual or metaphysical experience. But then the brain realizes, whoops, what am I doing? And it shuts it back down again, puts the blinders back on. And then you're left wondering, what the heck was that I just experienced? When in fact it was just a glimpse of the other world, as the Celts used to call it, the Anan, the other world. These are other world encounters, is what they are, and that's what UFOs are. That's what cryptids like Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster are, in my view. Now, that doesn't rule out the existence of real undiscovered animals. It doesn't rule out the existence of real extraterrestrial spacecraft. Some of these cases might involve real spacecraft. As I mentioned to you before, I certainly don't rule that out. It's a big universe. And I certainly don't rule out the existence of undiscovered animal life on this earth. But what I do say is that the vast majority of these cases, when you look at them carefully, it becomes obvious that what you're dealing with is something different from nuts and bolts technology, and something different from, in the case of cryptozoology, something different from biological organisms. That they only superficially resemble this, that their behaviors and the circumstances under which they're experienced indicates that there's something much different about these things, and that they are not what they appear to be.
Right. No, that's absolutely fascinating. I wanted to ask you this too. If someone were to come to you and say, "Look, I've had these very strange experiences. I saw some UFOs, and then I feel like I've been abducted. I've had these they're stressed out. They have a lot of anxiety. They're starting to recall these things. How would you, as a psychologist and a parapsychologist, how would you approach that case?"
Well, I've had cases like that. I've had a number of abduction cases over the years. And I have used regressive hypnosis with those cases, which is typical, the way to approach abduction experiences. But I also understand the limitations of hypnosis. I understand that that information revealed under hypnosis is not necessarily literal truth. Quite frequently, people who are hypnotized cannot distinguish between subjective and objective reality very well, and they may come to believe that something was an objective physical world experience when in fact it was a psychical world experience. So my goal, first of all, my goal is going to be primarily as a therapist. My goal is going to be to help them, to make them feel better about the experience or integrate the experience into their lives in such a way so that it's understandable and they can live with it. And that's my goal with dealing with victims or experiencers of hauntings and poltergeists also. I don't believe that science and technology currently can demonstrate the reality of these phenomena according to the standards set by establishment science.
Right.
So I don't think we're going to convince the scientific community that poltergeists are real or that ghosts are real or that aliens are real. I don't think we're going to do that. That's the hope, of course, that's held out by many parapsychologists and cryptozoologists and ufologists that one day they'll all know that it's but I don't think there's any likelihood that that's going to happen anytime soon. So what we can hope to do is to help people understand their experiences within the context of other people's experiences, that you're not alone. Many people have these experiences. I've never known anybody yet who's died from a haunting, a poltergeist, or an abduction experience. That although these experiences are traumatic and sometimes even painful and often terrifying, we learn from these experiences. That, again, looking at it from Carl Jung's standpoint of analytical psychology, these experiences indicate a disintegration or fragmentation of part of the psyche, but the reason that's occurring is because those parts of the psyche, those parts of the mind want to be reabsorbed, want to be reintegrated with the whole. So it's an opportunity for spiritual growth, is what I'm trying to say. And so that's the idea behind what I call humanistic parapsychology, is the idea that because humanistic psychology is based on the idea of self-actualization, of becoming a better person. How can you take the negative, the terrifying, the traumatic experiences of your life and integrate them in such a way so that you end up a better person for it? And so that's what I would try to do with these cases. That is what I try to do with these cases, because I know that I cannot demonstrate to the satisfaction of a well-informed scientific skeptic. I cannot demonstrate that these things are objectively real. And in fact, as I've already said, I think that they are sort of quasi-objective. I don't think they are objectively real. So I don't even attempt to do that anymore. Once upon a time I did, like many enthusiasts. I once had fantasies of being able to prove these things to the satisfaction of the scientific community. But I think in a way that we do our discipline, we do our study a disservice by focusing too much on that. I think that parapsychologists as well as ufologists and cryptozoologists all suffer from the same mental aberration, which I call science envy. That essentially they all want so desperately to be accepted as real scientists, quote unquote, that they're willing to ignore huge masses of data which are pertinent to what they're studying because it doesn't seem to fit with what they believe establishment science is likely to accept. And I got news for them. Establishment science isn't about to accept it anyway. So you might as well just look at the big picture. This is what you often find with ufologists or ufology. UFO enthusiasts often are so emotionally committed to the extraterrestrial hypothesis because that's the one that's the most scientifically plausible according to our understanding of, establishment Western science. Right. And the cryptozoologists are emotionally committed to the idea of undiscovered biological organisms, which again, is undoubtedly true. There are plenty of insects and even occasional mammals that are found that have never been discovered before, but that is a qualitatively different thing from Bigfoot or Mothmen or Jersey Devils. Those are entirely different things, even though they report them side by side as if they were talking about the same sort of thing. So yes, there are undiscovered animals, but I don't think Bigfoot is one of them. Yes, there are unexplained things in the sky, and some of these things are physical. I mean, obviously, there's a certain number of cases that are hoaxes. There are a certain number of cases that are misidentifications of astronomical objects or meteorological phenomena, weather balloons, and so on. So, but once you rule all of those out, there is a core of very mysterious cases which strongly suggests that there is a genuine anomaly here. There's a genuine paranormal phenomenon taking place. And then you try to expand that speculation to the idea that these are visitors from other planets, which they may be. But as I said, it would make a lot more sense if there was more consistency in the appearance, the behavior, and the motives of these various visitors. It would then make more sense that they are, in fact, an extraterrestrial race. Just in the same way Bigfoot would make more sense as an undiscovered hominid or undiscovered ape if they were only found in the Pacific Northwest, or they were only found in the Himalayan mountains, the Yeti. Then you might say, yeah, these are big wilderness areas. It's quite possible that something could survive there. But Bigfoot's found all over Florida. Bigfoot is found 50 miles from New York City. Bigfoot has been sighted in countries all over the world. And yet, other than footprints, not one piece of really verifiable physical evidence, including fossil evidence, has ever been found. And the same is true for UFOs. You have landing pod tracks, you have scorch marks, you have blurry photographs, basically the same sort of thing that you have in ghost phenomena. But there is nothing that you can really pin down and say, yes, this is something that can't be refuted. So I think you have to look at it as if they were some kind of an intermediate phenomenon, neither wholly physical nor wholly subjective and mental, but something in between, something that, as you put it, phases in and out of our physical reality. Whether that indicates they're phasing into another dimension or into another parallel world that's of a different energy frequency to ours, who knows? Or maybe they go through a wormhole to another solar system. I really don't know.
And yet, and you made this point, I think it's a great point to make, and yet with all of this, the experiences that people have are real, and they're as real to those people as the books that are behind us. And I think that's important. And I know you always took that approach to, as a psychologist, is like, look, people are having these experiences, and to these people, regardless of what these experiences are, they're being affected by them in a very profound way. And that's where what we, in many ways, need to focus on is, okay, you're having these experiences. Well, how could that make you a stronger person? How do we get past the fear and the anxiety and some of the negative things that come along with some of these experiences, and how could we make it a positive? And I think that's, and we've talked about this with ghost experiences that people have. If you have an apparitional sighting, that is a profound experience for people, regardless of what it is, regardless of what the origin of it is. So, from that standpoint, and I love that you do this, you focus on okay, well, how did it affect you, and how could it be a positive?
Yeah,
right? I know we've...
Absolutely true. And UFOs are the same way. As you've heard me say before, people say, do you believe in ghosts? People do experience ghosts. So yes, ghosts exist as human experiences, and UFOs exist as human experiences, and Bigfoot and other cryptids exist as human experiences. Now, and some people assume that I'm sort of humoring people when I use that term. Well, what you're really saying is that they're not real. No, I'm not. I am saying that as experiences, they are real. People's experiences are who they are. That's your life, is a series of experiences that you have. And the memory of everything that you've ever done in your life is a series of experiences, to one degree or another, distorted by the imperfections of human memory, but nevertheless is a series of snapshots of human experience that makes us who we are. So human experience is what gives meaning to life, and meaning is the only thing that makes us human. And that's the only thing that distinguishes us from other life forms, is that we ascribe meaning to things, which other creatures don't seem to do, as far as we can tell. So
Right.
I think that these are real experiences, at least in that sense. And I also believe that they're real in an even greater sense, that they are real in the sense that they probably pre-existed human beings. I personally do not believe, although again, you can't prove it one way or the other because we don't know the magnitude of the human unconscious. So they could be secondary to the human unconscious. I personally believe that they are primary to the human unconscious. In other words, they pre-existed human beings, whatever they are, whoever they are. They're the gods. Someone once asked me, so what are gods and goddesses and demons and spirits? What are these things? And my answer is they are personifications of natural and psychological forces. Just like Thor is the personification of thunder, and Aphrodite is the personification of love, which is a psychological force. They are personifications of psychological forces. And what is magic then? Magic is a technique by which those forces can be focused and directed, just like a child with a magnifying glass can focus and direct the rays of the sun to start a fire. These natural forces can be directed by the mind. They used to call that magic, and now we call it psi, or ESP, or psychic ability. It's all the same thing. It's the same thing that's been experienced around the world throughout human history. And there's some component of the mind which transcends physical reality, transcends time and space, so that we're able to gain information from distant sources, or from other people's minds, or even from probabilistic futures, or from events that have already taken place in the past about which we have no previous knowledge. So the mind at some level is far vaster and has access to far greater information and far greater power than we can comprehend at the physical level. And therefore that's the reality from which these experiences derive. These other world experiences, like UFOs, like cryptids, like ghosts, they derive from this other world that we connect with and of which we are a part. We are simply, the physical world is an island emerging from the sea of this psychical realm. And that sea was there before the island was. And the sea is the property from which the physical island has emerged. But the sea is fluid and changing. It appears in many different ways. The island looks solid and physical, but the sea is always changing. But which is the greater reality? The sea was there first. The sea is the one that is the greater reality. And I think that is the reality from which we all have arisen. But that's largely a philosophical digression. I understand that, so I apologize.
But you know what, though? It's fascinating, and it's this is so great talking about this. I love it. Well, talking about experiences, I wanted to, where this show is about alternative points of view, so it's not just really UFOs, and that's why I wanted to have you on. I know that you're so knowledgeable in that, and obviously hauntings and poltergeists and anything to do with paranormal phenomena. You've had over the years, and we've been doing this a while, you've been all over the world, literally investigating hauntings and poltergeist cases and different various studies that you've gotten grants for in countries, and you've done so much. And what I love if you can share with you have a couple of stories. If you can share one of them, I definitely want to have you back on the show because I think next time we can talk more about hauntings in general, the spirit world, whether it's retrocognition or precognition. We should get into all of that. We'll stick with the ghosts and that kind of phenomenon. But Can you share? I'm kind of putting you on the spot, but I know you recall this and you remember it very well. You over the years, you have had a couple of really. You've had a lot of experiences, but you've had a couple of what people might call a classic apparitional sighting experiences, and there's a couple that you've told me about that I love, and I love when you tell the stories. Would you share? I know there's one that occurred in Louisiana at Oak Alley. If you could recall that one, if you could share that with our viewers.
Well, Oak Alley Plantation, of course, is a very well-known location, beautiful plantation. People who have seen the movie Interview with the Vampire may have seen it there because that was the plantation that was used at the beginning of the movie. Now it's a museum, and there are several ghosts that are reputed to haunt the place. And while I was there, along with a group of investigators, this was on a day when the museum was closed, and some of the docents or the tour guides had come in costume to show us around. I think it was on a Sunday, so the museum, I think it was going to open later in the afternoon, but it wasn't open at the time we were there. And my point is simply that there was no one there except for myself, two other investigators, and then there were three young ladies in the antebellum costumes that were the docents or tour guides that were there. And at one point, I was walking around the outside of the plantation house, and one of the dormer windows, I happened to glance up, and I saw a young woman, a teenage girl, looking out of the window, appeared to be looking directly at me, and she was wearing one of these sort of antebellum costumes. I could only see her, of course, from just above the waist up, but from the design of her dress, I could see that it was basically the same type of costume. And I believe I waved at her because I assumed that she was one of the docents, and she didn't appear. She was looking at me, but she didn't smile or make any movement or wave or anything like that. And I didn't think anything of it. I had a camera around my neck. I didn't try to take a picture of her. Never occurred to me I was looking at a ghost. But then later, when I met the other docents that had come in as we were investigating, and this young girl was not among them, I asked one of the other docents where this young girl was, and they said, well, there's no one here that works here that looks like that, but that sounds like the ghost or one of the ghosts that people see there. And she showed me around. Among the artifacts that they have in this plantation are dozens and dozens of old 19th century photographs of different members of the family that owned this plantation. This was the Stewart family. And one particular photograph was a picture of a young girl named Jacqueline Stewart, who I recognized as being I was certain it was the same girl that I had seen. And she was a girl who had died in the house. She was a niece of the people who owned the house in the 19th century. And the room that I saw her in, the dormer window, was actually the room where the nieces stayed, according to the tour guide. Now, this was all very exciting, and I asked her to take me up to the room, and she did, the tour guide. And in the room, one of the things I noted was very interesting was that there was a huge exhaust fan that was mounted in that window so that there was no way to try to keep the upper part of the house cooler because it wasn't air conditioned. But what was very interesting is this exhaust fan was situated in such a way it took up most of the window. And so there was no way that I could have seen any person standing in that window because the fan would have blocked anybody that was standing there. And I even went back outside and looked up at the window again, and I could see the fan very clearly from the outside. Didn't look anything like this young girl that I had seen. Right. And when I saw the young girl, I didn't see any evidence of the fan. And so, I was sure that I was looking at the same window. So ultimately, basically, what I concluded was that I was essentially looking at a retrocognitive image, that I was walking around in a kind of a reverie or a very receptive, psychically receptive state, sort of allowing my mind to wander to days gone by, thinking back about what it must have been like when during antebellum times, living on this plantation. So I was in that sort of drifting, receptive state of consciousness, which is very conducive to psychic experiences. And I looked up and I saw this girl that was a product of another time, looking out of the window. But
Right.
it wasn't the window as it was that day, because that fan was nowhere to be seen. So I appear to be seeing something as it would have been 150 or 100 years ago. And so I think I was really looking at a snapshot back in time. Now, was that actually the spirit of this young girl that was conscious and observing me as I was observing her? I have no way of knowing that.
Right.
My impression was probably not.
Right. Maybe if she would have waved back.
Waved back, that would have distinctly indicated an interactive consciousness.
Right.
But she didn't. So my feeling was that it probably was a kind of psychic residue or imprint. But it is one of the few times that I've actually seen an apparition just as clear as day. But as I mentioned, as with the UFOs, at the time, it never occurred to me that I was having a paranormal experience, because this was broad daylight. It looked like a completely solid individual, and her manner of dress was consistent with these other young ladies that worked there. So it just never occurred to me that there was anything unusual about it, because everybody always said, well, why didn't you take a picture of it? Why would I have taken a picture?
Right. You thought it was one of the girls who worked there, right?
So it was just one of those interesting cases.
No, fascinating. And we're going to definitely, you'll come back on and we'll talk about retrocognition and all that. Just great stuff. I mean, it's just so fascinating. And we'll save a couple of your other stories for that. Okay. So we'll save that for the viewers. But tell us a little bit about the AIP, the American Institute of Parapsychology. Tell us about that. That's your organization. So tell us a little about that.
Well, the American Institute of Parapsychology is an organization that I founded back in 1993 for the purpose of being a clearinghouse for information. We do conduct some original research, but not really very much, especially anymore. Our primary function now is educational and informational. The idea is to provide educational opportunities for people who want education in various aspects of parapsychology and or metaphysical studies, and also to provide a source of information for individuals and the media about paranormal and parapsychological topics. So primarily we're a clearinghouse for information, either through educational courses and workshops. We offer a variety of educational courses and workshops, both residentially here in Gainesville, Florida, and also through distance education. And in addition to that, again, we do a lot of consulting for media, newspapers, magazines, television shows, and so on, who are interested in hopefully reliable information about paranormal experiences and parapsychology.
Can you tell everyone, tell our viewers how they can reach out if they wanted to?
The AIP has a website, which is parapsychologylab.com. Viewers are also welcome to email me if they have any questions they would like to ask at anichols@gru.net, or they can also email me through the website. And also would encourage everyone to read my book, Ghost Detective Adventures of a Parapsychologist. Also have a chapter in a new book that came out last year called Ghosts, Hauntings, and Spirits. And I have a chapter in there that's very pertinent to what we've been talking about today, called Haunted Houses, Theaters of the Mind. So I think that you might enjoy that as well.
No, that's great. And for the people who don't know, which is probably just about everyone in this case, but Dr. Nichols and I were on a TV show together. It seemed like a very long time ago. It was Ghost Detectives. And that was that Discovery? I think that was Discovery Channel. And Dr. Nichols was kind enough. I was a newbie at that point, but I was just getting my feet wet in this field as far as doing research. And he invited me to be part of the team that went to St. Augustine. And we could talk a little bit the next time we speak. We can talk a little bit about some of the things that happened in St. Augustine. That's a fascinating city and a very old city, reputed to be obviously extremely haunted. But yeah, no, and again, Dr. Nichols and I go back a long way, and I should have said this at the beginning, but how we met is very interesting, because I had been in another plantation in Louisiana, and this was in 1995, And I had taken some photographs, and remember, 1995, this was not digital, this was film. So I had a still camera with film, and I took some black and white and color photographs of the Myrtles Plantation, which is in St. Francisville, Louisiana. Now, of course, since 1995, it's become very popular. It's been on a lot of TV shows, and they've written books about it. But it's one of those plantations, one of the many plantations in Louisiana in the South that is reputedly very haunted. But what happened was I wound up taking a couple of photographs, one color one and one black and white. And the black and white one in particular was literally of a full-formed, almost pretty much full-form apparition on the front porch of this plantation. And I think what happened, Annie, is I originally contacted William Roll because I knew that I didn't know who else to contact, and I knew he was, I guess it was was it Duke University?
At that time, he would have been in West Georgia.
All right, West Georgia. So I contacted him there, and he suggested that I contact you because you had worked with him for a while, and I did, and I contacted Dr. Nichols, and I actually drove up to Gainesville with this photo, with all the photos, but and that's how we met, and I have to say, Andy, I call him Andy because we're good friends, and you've been a mentor to me all these years, really, truthfully, and I've learned so much from you. But that was a photograph, and again, we talk about that. So here's this photograph, and I captured something on this photograph that was very much associated with the actual haunting of this plantation, and I knew that you were pretty impressed with that photograph. I have to say, you were.
I still am. You know from our many conversations that as a general rule, I am not terribly impressed by the vast majority of so-called ghost photographs or paranormal photographs of any kind. And I will say that to this day, that remains one of the most impressive photographs I've ever seen. And whenever I show a slide of that photograph, I always tell my students that this is one of the few cases where I knew the person who took the photograph, right, and I know the circumstances under which the photograph was taken, and I know that there was nothing there to account for that image, nor can I account for it as a photographic anomaly. So there was something there, and right, I wish it were clearer, but it right, still remains one of the most impressive ghost photographs I've ever seen. So I'm very very impressed by that. And why, since you brought up the Myrtles, if we have a moment, I'd like to remind you of a different incident which relates in some way to what we've been talking about with UFOs tonight. Remember, at a different time, we took a team to the Myrtles, and you may recall that our mutual friend and colleague Scott had an experience there. And I think that's a very good illustration of what I've been talking about tonight, because his experience was that it was, I believe, a full moon that night. I was very bright with the moon, and he saw what he believed were two young people, two teenagers or children dressed entirely in white, who he believed completely were actual people, teenagers, but except that they were dressed all in white out there in the moonlight. And he said that they seemed to see him even though he was in the shadows, and didn't believe that he should have been visible, but they seemed to notice him, and as soon as they appeared to notice him, they took off running and sprinted into the woods or down that little road. And he said he almost took off after them because he fully believed that these were a couple of young people sneaking around at night. But as you'll recall, when we went out there to the area where he said he saw it, this was in the middle of a swampy area, right next to the pond. It was surrounded by a fence. There were no tracks there. I mean, we demonstrated very conclusive. Now, he was the only one that witnessed this. Right. But we know that Scott is a very rational and logical person, not given to overactive imagination or hallucinations. And we demonstrated very, very clearly that it was impossible for human beings to have been in the place where he said they were. There were no tracks, and it was all mud, so there would have been tracks there. And furthermore, he said they sprinted. He didn't see them jump or climb over this fence because in the dark he couldn't see the fence.
Right.
But showed that there was a fence there that they would have had to have climbed over in order to run away, which he said they didn't do. So and yet, as much as we explained that to him, he never would let go of the idea that they were physical, they were solid, because to him they appeared to be completely real. Just as with me and the young lady at the Oak Alley plantation, it never occurred to him that he was looking at something paranormal, because they appeared to be so physical, so three-dimensional, that the idea that he was looking at something nebulous and apparitional never even occurred to him. And yet, it had to be that.
Right.
It had to be that. And even the last time I talked to him about it, he still wasn't quite convinced.
He's still struggling with that after all these years.
And yet there was no way it could have been a physical person or two physical people as he thought it was. Right. So that's a good illustration of what I'm talking about. When people see something that appears to be a three-dimensional, solid, metallic object, doesn't necessarily mean that it is a three-dimensional, solid, metallic object. That these things, whatever they are, these apparitions, are quite capable and often do, in fact usually do, appear to be three-dimensional solid objects of one kind or another. Right. So we have to keep that in mind whenever we see something in the sky. And I'd kind of like to end on a quotation from one of the few famous ufologists that I ever met, and that was Gray Barker, who used to live, he was the guy who coined the term Men in Black, and he used to live in the next county over from me in West Virginia when I was a kid, where I lived just 25 miles from Point Pleasant during the time of the Mothman sightings. And he lived the next county over. And I was just a kid at the time, but he was already a very well-known figure. And a quotation from him is this, that he made in one of his lectures before he passed away. And that is, if you go out looking for a UFO and you don't see a UFO, he said, do not look for them in outer space. Do not look for them beneath the sea or even in the hollow earth. Look deep inside yourself, and there you will see.
Very apropos. Dr. Nichols, as usual, thank you so much. This was an incredible conversation, very enlightening. Your work is amazing. The way you approach this area of study is absolutely commendable. And we're glad to have you on tonight, and we're looking forward to obviously having you on again in the near future. Just so everyone knows, this will be on Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern. We will be uploading this as both a Skype video and also as an MP3. So if someone just wanted to listen to it, they could as well. Dr. Nichols, thank you again. Thanks for coming on, and thank you for spending the time with us. This was, again, very enlightening, and hopefully we'll have you on again soon.
I hope so. Thanks for having me, Jack. It's been a pleasure, as always.
No, you're welcome. Take care.
You too. Good night.
Good night.